This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is The Mirror or Mirror by Andrei Tarkovsky. I'll be talking with Louise Milne about it and why it's a great film. The subject is Andrei Tarkovsky's film Mirror, and Louise Milne is my guest. Like I like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, so I have to ask the obvious question in the room, Louise. Are you related to A.A. Milne?
No,
No?
but it's very useful for spelling my name.
So, if you could, though, give me a little background about who you are, where you come from. Are you a film critic, a filmmaker, and opening thoughts about Tarkovsky in general?
Okay, well, I'm Scottish. I live in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. I also make experimental films, and I write about comparative mythology. So I'm kind of both an academic and a filmmaker. And I discovered Tarkovsky. It's strange, actually. Someone had told me long ago in Boston, where I did my postgrad, that I should never watch Tarkovsky except on the big screen. And eventually, someone screened Andrei Rublev, and I went along, and it was absolutely amazing. Blew me away. And similarly, I waited to see Mirror on the big screen as well. I kind of did not watch the VHS or the DVDs, and that was exactly like experiencing a dream or being in some kind of dream world. It's marvelous. So, some years ago, myself and my partner, Sean Martin, Sean had just written a short introduction to Tarkovsky, and my subject was the history of dreams, so we thought we'd put that together and study Tarkovsky in relation to dreams. And that's so we started interviewing people and making films about that. So we made a short one about Andrei Rublev and a much longer one about Mirror, The Dream in the Mirror, and that was for Criterion. And last year we finished one about Tarkovsky and the Sacrifice. And now I'm working on one about Tarkovsky in Italy. So it's been Tarkovsky for the last decade or so.
So, when you said you study mythology, are we talking classical mythology, or are we talking sort of artist-specific mythology? Because every artist has their mythos. James Joyce has his mythos. Tarkovsky has his mythos. Bergman has his mythos, that kind of thing. What kind of mythology?
Well, comparative mythology is putting together or looking for similarities. I'm particularly interested in the visual aspects of mythology, so I'm interested in things like the last thing I wrote was about shape-shifting in Norse mythology.
Yeah.
But I've also written about mermaids and nightmares and things like that. So it's not someone's personal mythology, it's more mythology as a sort of collective memory of cultures and how that's carried and how it's transmitted and what visuality has to do with that.
Yeah, I've done a number of shows not only on classical mythology, but religion as mythology of, for example, UFOs. People have the whole kind of thing about lake monsters, Bigfoot, that kind of thing. So that's why I was just interested. Even things like Paul Bunyan here in America, sort of corporate mythology, how these things spring out of things. It's interesting you mentioned Andrei Rublev, because I think Mirror is the best. I think he's got Tarkovsky has I think three undeniably great films: Rublev, Solaris, and Mirror. And I look at Andrei Rublev, when I first met it, there's a lot of dangling threads, things. It's not as tight and poetic as this film, but I call that sort of. I've always made the distinction in art between perfect art and great art, and I'd rather have great art, because you can make something perfect that is perfect, but it's kind of irrelevant.
Careless.
Yeah. Whereas a great film can have some errors or not be perfect, but do that. Now, to me, Rublev is an imperfect great film. This, though, is a perfect great film. It really captures the experience of dreaming. I once did a poem called Congolium Footfalls, which I said is a perfect poem, but it's just a poem about walking and a dream logic. It didn't have anything greater to it. Would you agree with that? And would you say Rublev is an imperfect but great film, whereas this is a perfect but great film, or not?
I think Rublev, I guess despite its imperfections, I think that the wrong way to go into Rublev is to think that it's going to be a film about Andrei Rublev.
Yeah.
I mean, he's off screen for a lot of it. But if you think of it as a film about Russia, about the birth of Russia in a way, and everyone says it's about the role of the artist. Andrei Rublev is a painter. He paints icons. He's living in the 15th century, although everything in the film looks a good deal older than that. It looks medieval.
Yeah.
But he doesn't want to paint pictures that terrify people. And in the meantime, Tarkovsky also manages, at the age of 30, so 29 when he started, to produce these extraordinary set pieces, enormous battle scenes, rolling plains full of horses, all kinds of stuff. I mean, he had the most extraordinary free hand with his budget. So it's in some ways it's like a Western. In some ways, or like something like Once Upon a Time in the West. It has this extraordinary kind of feeling of space in it. So yeah, I think that it definitely is a film of 4 parts, which initially seemed to come out of a clear blue sky, but at the end and after several viewings, I think it does all kind of hang together. But I agree with you that Mirror is much more perfect in terms of its form, its structure. Yeah.
Yeah, the one scene in Rublev that always sticks out with me is the Tartars when they come in with the horses and the horses are falling off when they storm the castle or whatever it is. But so this is the first show that I've done about Tarkovsky's film. So I'm going to ask you if you could give a little bit of background to those who don't know a little bit about Andrei Tarkovsky. Now we know his father was a poet. What do we know else about his background that led him to filmmaking?
Okay. Well, he was born in 1932, so he was a kid during the Second World War. And in fact, before the Second World War, his father had left his mother and set up house with someone else. But I think in Tarkovsky's mind, these things merged. The father being sent off to war became the reality of his childhood. He missed his father very much. He had a slightly younger sister, Marina, and he and his mother and his sister were living in a place near Ivanovo, way up north in a dacha, for essentially the entire period. And things got hard. Even in the countryside, things got hard. There was little food. The story that is told in Mirror of his mother going to pawn earrings to get some money, that's a true story, except that in reality she was successful and came back with a sack of potatoes. In the film, she is too ashamed to go ahead with it, really. So Tarkovsky grew up then in a world where his mother was an educated literary woman. He said later that he thought that she had shaped him, almost compelled him to become an artist. But he also missed his father very much. And his father was a leading poet, very well known. I don't know what the equivalent would be in English language terms. Someone like Robert Frost almost. Someone really famous. Yeah. And his father was the center of Moscow literati life, so Tarkovsky had that influence as well. And then, I don't know, it seems like he was a dreamy kid, he was a difficult kid, a difficult teenager. He had a couple of false starts at college. He initially went off to study geology and spent some time in Siberia. I think that was an important influence. He saw the great spaces, and he put these things into Rublev to some extent. And then finally someone suggested that he went to Vagik, which was the huge Moscow Film School. And he arrived there at really a very fortunate time. Stalin was gone, Brezhnev was in power, the so-called Brezhnev thaw had started, and for the first time, this is the late 50s, you could see people in Moscow who looked just like students elsewhere. They were wearing blue jeans, they were wearing leather jackets, they read Hemingway, they read Proust, yeah, and so he was very much a star in his generation, in his milieu. He studied at Vagik, and the great thing about the old Soviet film system is that if you majored in directing, film directing, as he did, then immediately you graduated, you were given a film to direct. And so he was given a script for what turned into Ivan's Childhood. He and a number of friends of his, some of whom later collaborated on Rublev, Vadim Yusov, the cinematographer, so 5 or 6 years older. And the first thing he did with Ivan's Childhood, which is a story about a child soldier in the war that had really only just ended, was that he put dreams into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Marina Tarkovskaya, his sister, told me when we interviewed her that the family used to relate their dreams to each other at the breakfast table. So they were used to dream sharing, to focusing on dreams, to thinking about dreams, and that is something I think that carried over in his later life.
Yeah.
He was a temperamental person.
Yeah.
He was lucky in that during this brief period of the thaw, he was given these huge resources and essentially a free hand to some extent. Yeah, but pretty soon he clashed with the authorities. They didn't like his cut of Rublev. They thought that it was not nationalistic enough, not patriotic enough. So they wouldn't let that be shown. He was annoyed about that. Eventually the film did leak out. It was shown in Paris, it was shown at other film festivals. And then immediately after that, he would have liked to have done the film that he had in mind about his childhood, which eventually became Mir. He was thinking about it as early as 1964, when he was still working on Rublev. But instead, they gave him the Solaris project, which of course he did brilliantly. And then afterwards, after that, around about 1970, he had a few pages, which Konchalovsky, his friend, partner, scriptwriter on Ivan's Childhood, also film director, had read, and he couldn't see how this could possibly be a script. Tarkovsky published this as a short story. That got people's attention, that got people interested, and eventually he was given permission to go ahead in about 1972 or so.
Mm-hmm. So it is the middle film, number 4 of his 7 major films. I guess he might have done a few small student films, but his 7 major films, it's directly in the middle. You'd mentioned Ivan's Childhood, and the film that I think a number of people, including me, compare it to is Come and See, the film. But even though Come and See is much more explicit in terms of the violence, I think Ivan's Childhood is a better film because it does have those dream sequences. We get an interior of that boy, whereas the boy in Come and See, we're just sort of shock and awe.
That's right. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that also it shows Tarkovsky's extraordinary capacity to think visually.
Yeah.
The dream sequences, there's one where he is essentially shooting up to the top of a whale. Yeah, and there's a time shift that goes on. They're hiding out, him and his the boy, about 12 years old, and his party of partisans, and the camera goes up and then into a different time.
Mm.
And then at the end as well, without wanting to give away spoilers, is an absolutely extraordinary scene where the boy's spirit, as it were, is running over the sand into a kind of world of pure light. And as a sort of way of retrieving death, it's astonishing. So it's, in a way, a film about life as much as it is a film about war, and it has that quality where it's, if you come and see a terrific film, but it's really, really down. I mean, nothing happy happens. There's no relief.
There's a term that's used in a lot of Latin American writing called magical realism, but yet it seems to me that Tarkovsky's films are a better embodiment of that term than a lot of the writing and some of the films that have been made of those Latin American writers, because it seems to me that Tarkovsky's magic, if you will, is based and comes out of the realism. You couldn't have one without the other. Whereas with a lot of the Latin American magical realism of literature, it's basically just modern fairy tales in a sense. Would you say that Tarkovsky has sort of like, where would you, if you agree with the magical realism claim that, as I stated it, do you think it's about 50-50? Because it seems to me that it's always in a balance here, whether we're getting shots of, what is it, the end of Stalker, where is it the little girl or the little boy that's able to move the cup on the table or something like that? Do you think that he has that sort of dip into going just beyond the pale? I mean, we don't see grand wizards in anything, but we do see a little bit more of the human, what humans might become, kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that he understands the capacity of cinema as a medium to move in and out of an interior point of view. So there's an amazing moment in Stalker where the guide, the stalker through this spooky post-war sort of landscape, falls asleep by a stream, and the camera moves over his face as a shot of a black dog on the side of the river, and then just drifts upstream in the shallow water, and a voiceover comes in from the Book of Revelations about the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But there is gentle music in the background, and the whole thing, in some ways, is absolutely terrifying, but in other ways, it's just beautiful and calm. And it's as if he is following Stalker's mind. And similarly, when he uses dreams in mirror, very often there is a formal opening to that. The boy waking up, the boy in bed wakes up, hears something, and goes and sees essentially something impossible. Yeah? And if you had to interpret that, you'd have to say the boy believes that he's dreaming, or we are seeing the boy's dream. On the other hand, what Tarkovsky shows is the child getting up out of bed, walking through, seeing his parents, the father helping the mother wash their hair. And then the one scene that everyone remembers from that is the mother with her very long hair over her face and starts shaking it, and so the water drops go, and then the ceiling starts slowly collapsing. The rain comes in to the space. Now, that's almost a kind of nightmarish image. And yet the way that it's done, it's very clear all the time. It's naturalistic, as you say. It's obviously a woman washing her hair. it's equally obviously seen from the child's point of view a terrifying sight because his mother's face is completely hidden by the hair. It's as if she's turned into some kind of monster. And then that is echoed in the mise en scène, which starts sort of disintegrating. Yeah. So he's always very careful to move you, to graft you carefully into the dream scene. Yeah, so that there is a sort of a glide, really. Yeah, and then sometimes there is a shock when the person wakes up, or a cut, or some other odd thing happens.
So let's talk now specifically more about Mira. His first film, Ivan's childhood, was the recent Russian past. Andrei Rublev is, if we would call it, the deep Russian past. And then we get the cosmic view of things, the Solaris, a planet that's a living being, an ocean. And then we sort of pull back right into the personal. And the characters of Mira seem to be, if not direct one-for-one people in his life. It's a very similar to what we know about his own personal life. Where does the title come from? In Russian, the title is what? Zerkalo, is it pronounced? Is it?
Zerkalo.
Zerkalo?
Yeah, Zerkalo. Mirror. Well, he had a number of titles for it when he first pitched it. It was going to be called Confession.
Uh-huh.
And nobody liked that, including him. All through the shoot, it was going to be a Russian phrase which translates as either white, white day or bright, bright day. It's a word that could mean either thing, and that's a quote from one of his father's poems. And then he decided that that was too weak as well. So Mirror, I don't know, there's a great story that Dmitry Seletsyn, a Russian scholar that we interviewed, he went to write an article about the shoot of Mirror. He went up there on the train to near Ivanovo, where they had built this replica dacha, which was a model, a copy of the house that Tarkovsky remembered, recreated from photographs. And Dmitry said that when he got to the place, it was surrounded by forest, and that Tarkovsky had caused mirrors to be placed everywhere. So there were mirrors resting against tree trunks, mirrors on the grass, and the house itself is filled with mirrors. And if you look at the film Mirror, there is in fact a mirror in pretty nearly every scene, which is visible. Why a mirror? I think he's thinking about doubles. I think he's thinking about. There's a line in Cocteau's Orphée where Lady Death says, if you want to see my work, look in the mirror. Time passing, the notion of contemplating the self, the idea that this is indeed some kind of self-portrait. Many painters, as Tarkovsky would have known in the Renaissance, used mirrors. To Dürer, notably, in his portrait of himself, essentially as Jesus. Mirror, I think he ultimately decided had all these multiple meanings, and that was that helped think about it. That helped sort of condense the meaning of the film in some way. What is it a mirror of? A mirror of his memories, a mirror of his childhood traumas, his loss of his father, but then also, because he includes these documentary sequences, a mirror of the recent history of the past.
But we also get a lot of scenes that seem to be plays or takes off one another. We constantly go back to people looking off into the distance. We get the workplace, different aspects of that. It reminds me of the scene from Orson Welles' film Lady from Shanghai, where they're in the funhouse mirror and you're seeing the same people look. Now there you're actually seeing, people actually looking at each other. But here it's sort of a hall of mirrors of memory in the main character's mind. And it also reminds me of Theo Angelopoulos's Eternity in a Day, where he sort of turns around and walks into the past or something. This isn't quite as I guess you'd call it maybe melodramatic as that moment, but those moments. But this film, you don't get the sharp cuts. You might go a minute and a half into a scene and be, oh wait, this is in the past. It doesn't. You're never quite sure of where you are in time.
That's right. And that's because, in the end, I mean, there were lots and lots of different ways in which he could have shot the footage. And really, all he had at the start of the shoot was essentially a handful of scenes, maybe 28 scenes, some of which were dropped, some of which were new things were substituted. He didn't really know how it was all going to hang together. Mm-hmm. So what he did, which is really amazing, is that in a sense he merges the character of the father and the son. So in the film, when he shows us a boy, it's never totally clear whether this is himself as a boy in the here and now, in the 1970s maybe, or in the 1930s. Or whether it is his father's memories of being a boy. And the mirror scenes, one in particular, quite near the beginning of the film, where the 12, 13-year-old boy stares into a mirror, and the camera just follows his gaze into the reflection.
Yeah.
It's a very long shot. And this in particular, I think Tarkovsky was proud of. He saw it as the key to the whole thing, that one could telescope in and out of one's parents' lives through the imagination and memory.
And the other film that comes to mind is a rather obvious one, and that's the 1972 version of Slaughterhouse-Five, which would have been released just as he's making this film. I wonder, did he ever see that film that we know of? Because that's a more comic take on the bombing of Dresden, and Vonnegut is a comic writer. This, though, is a more serious and sober take on memory and tripping through time.
I don't think he could have seen anything quite that recent. There's a strange note as he was after he had assembled the crew for Mirror. There's a memo that exists asking the authorities' permission for screenings of a whole list of films for the crew. Right, the first one is Goldfinger.
Yeah.
This is From Russia with Love. He wants to see. And Once Upon a Time in the West is on there too. Yeah, so it's a list of sort of 5 popular Western films, and then things like Zero de Conduit and what's the other one? I think Amarcord, Fellini's autobiographical film, which had been screened also in Moscow. So. It's not like they were unaware of Western filmmaking, but I don't think that they saw avant-garde Western filmmaking. I think that they knew about people like Cocteau and Buñuel and so on, but what exactly trickled through these mainstream films would be bought by the authorities, but not screened publicly. So he's living in a world of strict censorship, and yet there are all these tricks in it. It's not really a very effective censorship. He does get to, the new Fellini and so on.
It's a film that could only it's a story that could only have been put on a film. It's something that would probably not have the impact because it's a highly visual film. but it does bring to mind a literary term that I don't know if you know of. John Keats coined a term called negative capability,
Yeah.
and basically what that is that it's the ability to take two things that are seemingly disparate, but once you make some kind of connection between them, something goes off in someone's mind and say, ah, that's obvious. You know, that's all been all along. And Tarkovsky seems to be one of those sort of filmmakers that really parties in that, whether he knew of the term or not. Number one, would you agree with that assessment of the way he approached film? Because he said he didn't know necessarily what he was doing at various stages in making the film. And did he know anything about that idea of negative capability?
He certainly would have done.
Yeah.
He was well read
Yeah.
in the Western classics. He would have known his Keats.
Yeah.
He would have, he read Proust. He read Goethe. He read, of course, all the Russian classics. But he also knew the Greeks, the Romans, British literature, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he would have known about that. I mean, he knew about Nietzsche. He knew about Faust. He knew about all these things. And indeed, I think his own, this is possibly the most intuitive film that he ever made.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, his process was intuitive throughout this film, having been given, to some extent, carte blanche, again, a green light for this, with a lot of discussion in the institution among his fellow directors, not all of which was negative by any means. Yeah, people gave him good advice. Everybody liked the idea of mixing fiction with the documentary footage, for example, as a means, as giving another layer of time. Yeah. So, yeah, negative capability. I mean, the film does not explain. It leaves you with central mysteries. It is a film which, in the end, arguably, rationally, does not compute. You can't solve it.
Well, it's almost like an Ouroboros, you know,
Yes.
the snake eating its own tail.
That's right. So he presents, so to speak, in the wrong order. He presents the mother lonely, apparently longing for her absent husband. In the film, there is, to some extent, a more romantic reason for him being absent. In other words, it's not because he's deserted her for another woman, it's because he's gone off to war. So that becomes a kind of concentrated element. And then there is the couple in the present day, the divorced couple, the woman played by the same actor who seem to be the parents of the boy in the film. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And they have bitter conversations, right? Modern conversations. Mm-hmm. And then, right at the very end, he shows the couple together, and she is pregnant, presumably with the child, yeah, who is the protagonist, the father-son composite, and they're lying there happy in the sun, and he says to her, "Do you want a boy or a girl?" And then the camera swings round and shows the older mother, played by Tarkovsky's mother herself, with two young children. So the time level in this very end sequence, he dots people around and brings them together in the same shot in an impossible way. Yeah.
Probably the most famous film director in the West that was bruiting Tarkovsky as a great filmmaker was Ingmar Bergman. What was the relationship between Bergman and Tarkovsky, assuming that they ever met?
They almost met. Yeah. They claimed to want to meet, and then one time when this could have happened, they walked by each other. It's a strange story. Bergman had a tight team in Sweden. He, after a certain point, he essentially filmed all of his works of the 60s with the same crew. He in the semi-socialist kind of cinema of the Swedes, he was able to sign people up for 10-year contracts for a commitment of, say, 6 films. I mean, he made a lot of films.
Yeah.
And he had his crew, and he screened Only Rublev, Iris Childhood, every single film he could get by Tarkovsky for the whole crew. He made them watch them all. Yeah. And people were blown away, of course. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Tarkovsky, I mean, this is a bit strange to our thinking. Again, you have to remember it's the thaw. It's not one of the very tight antagonistic points of the Cold War. It's not the time of the Berlin Air one. But Tarkovsky actually managed to travel a great deal. I mean, he won the Golden Lion at Venice, the gold and the silver, for Iris Childhood, and they let him go to pick up that award. He and Yusuf were in London during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, and Yusuf says that they got some very wary looks from the Londoners at the time, right? So, and he had access to Bergman's films. He certainly knew them all, and he loved them. He thought that Bergman was, in a sense, the greatest modern master. Him and Kurosawa, perhaps. He knew Antonioni's work as well, which was only just becoming known in English language circles from, say, 66 on. So, yeah, he you know, why didn't they want to meet? It was partly because by the time they could have met, which was in the early 80s in Stockholm, when Tarkovsky was starting to work on what became his last film, The Sacrifice, Tarkovsky had essentially got the whole of Bergman's crew together to make his film for him. Yeah, and he was shooting on Gotland, which was Bergman's island.
Yeah.
So Bergman must have felt a little strange that he was being superseded by this somewhat younger guy who had got all of his people together. Although the film that Tarkovsky made down there was very, very different. And anyway, they were eyeing each other, aware of each other, at two ends of this small reception, and yet they could not bring themselves to talk.
Well, it's interesting because I don't know what period this time they would have met, but I've often thought that his last film, The Sacrifice, which has Erland Josephson as the lead character, is really second-rate Bergman. It's like he was aping Bergman. It's the least Tarkovsky of his major films.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that there are marvelous bits in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you watch it on the big screen, I had a chance to recently at the main film festival. It was really astonishing, and you forgot about the really dreadful female characterization and the other sorts of problems with the plot or the sense. Yeah, when you can just let it all wash over you. But I think that there are some moments where he's obviously channeling Bergman, where he does, for example, a dark silhouette of Erland Josephson against a sort of grey horizon with mist coming in. These are shots.
And isn't there a sound of like jet fighters, or there are jets in the sky? And it reminds me of a scene in Shame by Bergman where we hear jet fighters coming. Obviously, Shame was, I think, a much more lower budgeted film than Sacrifice was, but
Sacrifice also. Yeah, I mean the plot, such as this, is that essentially there has been a nuclear attack. This was something that Tarkovsky knew about. He was a cosmopolitan guy who shared, in a way, the sort of fear of that Third World War, which faced us all in the 70s and the 80s until the point when the wall came down. Right? Everyone in the West knew that we were sort of 2 minutes away from, the planetary sort of suicide. The Russians didn't, normal Russians didn't worry about that so much. They saw any future war almost exclusively in terms of World War II, or so I've been told. But Tarkovsky knew about the bomb. He puts footage of Hiroshima in Mirror. It's right there. And he also had a kind of dream or nightmare about it in 1972, which is roughly when he was sort of putting Mirror together. So, yeah, and then he makes it all happen, so to speak, in The Sacrifice, except that it turns out to have all been a dream, arguably. Yeah. And the sound of the planes is there, and the TV channel going offline is there, and so on. Yeah.
Before we end this interview, I do want to talk about the influence Tarkovsky had on other filmmakers, but I want to talk about specifically now the influence of this film on other films, because we've mentioned how this film sort of has that Ouroboros effect. You come back, we get a mixture of characters that shouldn't be in the frame together because they're of different times, different periods. And there's a lot of the scenes, I think, that are slow, and you get the same images or the same types of images. And to me, the obvious heir of Tarkovsky is Béla Tarr. If you look at his films, he sort of took what Tarkovsky is doing here, and in his late '80s films, through his last couple of films, not the Trojan Horse, the one with the horse in it, and especially Satan Tango, Werckmeister Harmonies. These seem to be almost you couldn't have those films without having had Tarkovsky make Mirror.
No, I totally agree. And I think even, although visually, stylistically they're rather different, you could also maybe add Wim Wenders to this, in terms of putting together films which essentially resist plot or logical analysis. I think I think that I think that what's different, though, and this is an interesting one. I was thinking about this just the other day. If you compare them, say, to the guys in France who were doing similar things with narrative disconnect, and even, if you like, breaking the fourth wall or playing around with time in various ways, but they're doing it in this sort of deadpan, ironic way. Yeah. It doesn't have the romantic seriousness of Tarkovsky, for whom something spiritual always seems to be at stake in his films. Yeah. And arguably there's a bit of that in Tar. Yeah, but it's not really there in the new wave. Fassbinder.
To me, Godard and especially someone like Fassbinder, they seem to be sort of empty gestures. They're not. They seem to be aping what came earlier. Whereas Tarkovsky, and especially in Mirror, is putting more into the scenes. You can have someone, looking off into the distance, as happens a few times in this film. And it's just nice background scenery. There's some rolling hills. There's this, or you might even have a burning barn, as you do in one of the most famous scenes. But there's more to that, and I think it gets back to the thing with Béla Tarr. He uses repetition in his films, and I've said that, for example, Satan Tango is like 7.5 hours. But when you remember it, it's a much shorter film because the mind tends to compress things like an accordion. The thing that I find, though, with Tarkovsky is a lot of people will say, well, I don't understand this scene or that character or whatnot, but then it's dream logic. And I'm like, my view is it's not the dream logic, but it's the way memory works. And memory is imperfect. We are constantly reconstructing things. If you and I went to a bar and had a few beers and were talking about something, your memory is going to naturally differ from my memory. And not only is it going to differ our memories will differ. They will change over time because we are not perfect recording machines. A film is generally thought to be a perfect recording machine, even though it's not really, and it's fiction. But I think Tarkovsky plays off of that dissonance between the fact that we want to accept what we see as real on film, but he knows that it's not.
Absolutely. I mean, that I really agree with. I guess a couple of things about that. One is, if one were looking for heirs to Tarkovsky, one could also look sort of beyond cinema. What about Milan Kundera? The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, the Unbearable Lightness of Being. There's something similar there. I mean, there is more humor in Kundera, but there is the same sense of sort of dislocated time and a kind of randomness which turns out to be significant and so on. Yeah. But equally, I think that, this business about memory, and absolutely, it is as much a study of memory as it is of dreams, and the mythifying processes of memory. So in one's childhood, one's parents are gods, essentially, and that godlike status conditions all the memories, right? So this isn't just any old mother. She is an archetypal mother, young, beautiful, even old, and looking after what could be her own grandchildren, but they're actually versions of her own children. That kind of thing. The father is father. There he is. He only has 2 or 3 scenes where he's actually on in front of the camera. He comes home from war and he gathers the 2 kids in his arms. This is a really iconic and mythic. He's studying almost in a super conscious way how exactly it is that we make our memories into myths or merge aspects of myth with memory, and comes up with this really extraordinary film.
But everyone is going to have their own mythos. If your father was a drunk and left your mother when you were 3 years old, your archetype of the male presence is going to be different than someone who had a father who was wonderful and had 6 kids and was good to all of them when the mother died tragically, that kind of thing. So everyone has their own mythologies that they're creating, and so,
Sure, but if you try and aspects of Murrow obviously are autobiographical. He used old family photographs taken, in fact, by his godfather, who was a professional photographer, to recreate this dacha. On the other hand, that's just the exterior of the dacha. The dacha itself, he fills with beautiful polished tables and lovely glass vases, and it's impossible to believe that this is a farmhouse in the back of beyond. It has this haute bourgeois kind of quality, right? And similarly, he was detached from his parents. His father did abandon him. He loved his father very much, but he also never felt close to him. So he is making up something that, in a sense, is for all of us. I think one of the most telling scenes is when he includes the scenes of the Spanish Civil War refugees, the children getting on the ship to be taken away to a new life in Russia and never to see Spain again. And then he has another scene where these children, by now grown up, one of them tries to do a Spanish dance, a fiesta, and is roughly stopped by her father or one of the elder men. They won't allow the refugee grown-ups anything to do with Spanishness. Only they are the sort of bearers of only they can know, right? So there's lots of, and equally there's the spiky conversations between the divorced people. There's an element of criticism there, which arguably is sort of coded criticism of his father.
Yeah, just by your mentioning that, it made me think of, I forget the director, but The Spirit of the Beehive.
Oh, yes, everything.
Yeah, and the little girl, the main character there, sort of makes an archetype of the Frankenstein's monster that she sees on screen, and yet she's controlling the monster in her mind, in her memory of that, and it's not nearly as refractive as Mira is, but it has that same kind of quality.
It absolutely does. And in fact, in many ways, it's an excellent parallel to Mirror, if there is a parallel.
Mm.
Because what the Spirit of the Beehive does also involves two little girls who are growing up essentially unconscious of the fact that their parents are deeply detached from them and
Yeah.
by our standards damaged by the war. Yeah, and that's what's going on in Mirror as well. Well, there's something very interesting there. It is films which speak for a whole generation. Yeah, this idea of post-trauma. The kids don't really remember the war, and yet they are shaped by it.
Mm.
You know, and that's shown really very beautifully in both these movies.
So before we wrap up and talk about the influence that Tarkovsky has had, is there anything about this film that we haven't really brought up that you feel is important? Because this is a show basically as to why this film is great. So is there any point that we've missed?
I think that we could maybe draw people's attention to the poetry, right? This is, and there are some, every now and then I think that there are 6 or maybe 8 poems spoken, and they are the poems of Arseny Tarkovsky Sr., and they are often poems about love, about memory, about lost childhood.
Mm.
Yeah, and they appear only on the soundtrack.
Mm.
And sometimes he matches them curiously with, or he forms an interplay. There are scenes where the mother is essentially sobbing or quietly trying not to cry, and this glorious love poem plays underneath.
Yeah.
And the question that raises is this the love that the poet felt for her once, or is it the love he feels for a new person? Yeah, and equally, Tarkovsky puts a piece of footage from World War II, which is a bunch of Russian soldiers essentially walking over this bog, this mud flat, Lake Sivash.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes on for quite some time. Yeah. And it is, in fact, a piece of footage that was discovered and developed and put in the archives after most of them were killed, shortly after this moment. Right? So there's a sort of sense of death. And then the Arseny Tarkovsky's poem underneath that is again about love and memory and the joy of life and emotion recollected in tranquility. We were speaking about Keats' negative capability. Wordsworth and Coleridge had this thing about poetry should be emotion recollected in tranquility, right? So there's a distance there, a distance, and only then can the emotion be made potent and poetic, right? So that business, the fact that he never shows the father's voice is there, the father talks on the phone, the father talks from outside the frame to his estranged wife, but he's never shown. Yeah, and the question of whether or not it's his memories or his son's memories that are actually unrolling is not made clear. But that absence of the father from the frame and then the presence of the father on the soundtrack is actually really interesting.
Yeah. It's as if the father has a gravitas that is inexplicable to those within the film.
That's right.
So let me just then wrap up with 2 final questions. One, why would you say that Mira is a great film? And 2, why would how would you why should someone who hasn't ever seen it see it?
Okay, well, I think that it's an extraordinary visual experience, and however different one's life has been in our position of birth in the century, I would certainly say that this is a film that is going to make you think about childhood and memory and the relationship of one's individual life and these extraordinarily powerful moments, the moments that are seared into your mind from your own childhood, which could be the barn burning down, or a red ball bouncing down the street, or a pitcher of milk being spilled, or a dream. All of these things, I think, will be evoked for the modern viewer by this film, and that is its real extraordinary achievement. Yeah, it's about, in a sense, a kind of experience of time and life that eventually all of us will have. Everyone who grows up, as Jung says, right, becomes, in a sense, has to grow into the archetype of the parent, even whether or not you have kids yourself. And you can then see things from the parent's point of view, and you can see your own childhood from another point of view. And this is the only film I can think of, Spirit to Be Had comes very close, which is going to really give us that experience of doubleness, of the intertwining of childhood and adulthood in this way.
I think people often make an error in thinking that there's one particular interpretation, and I think that a lot of times people think that just because an artist says this is what this work is about, the intent doesn't matter that much. And I think this is a film that shows that a work of art, especially a great one, can have multifarious meanings, and they're all equally valid. It's just a matter of which one resonates most with that particular viewer.
That's right.
So, Louise Milne, I will link to your Edinburgh webpage, your university webpage, and I want to thank you for speaking with me for about an hour on this great film.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Dan.